The prairie wind carried dust across the wide open land, sweeping along the smell of horses and dry sage. The sun was lowering, painting the sky in long streaks of gold and rust. Life on the ranch had its share of struggles, but nothing could have prepared me for the day I stumbled across them, two towering Apache sisters, strong as stone cliffs, standing in the middle of a fight that should have ended their lives. I didn't go looking for trouble that day, but trouble sure found me. And when I drew my rifle and made my choice, everything changed. The land out here didn't forgive weakness. Bandits, outlaws, and men who'd take whatever they could get from whoever was weaker roamed the trails like wolves. I had learned to keep to myself, tend my herd, and keep the fences mended. But when I saw those sisters cornered by a gang of men who had more greed than sense, I couldn't turn away. They were unlike anyone I had ever seen, tall as trees, with muscles carved from years of living wild and free. Their dark eyes carried both fire and sorrow, and for a moment, I almost hesitated. These weren't women who needed saving, yet in that instant, surrounded and outnumbered, even giants needed a hand. I fired the first shot before I knew I was going to. The echo rolled across the hills like thunder, and the fight erupted. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the world turned to smoke and lead. When the dust settled, most of the gang lay sprawled in the dirt, the rest scattering into the horizon. The sisters hadn't hidden behind me. They fought with a fury I'd never seen, every strike from their arms like the swing of a hammer. Still, without me stepping in, it might have gone another way. That's how I came to save them. Or maybe, truth be told, we saved each other. I thought that would be the end of it. I figured they'd nod their thanks, mount their horses, and disappear into the wild lands where they belonged. But that's not how it happened. They followed me back to my ranch, silent and watchful, like shadows I couldn't shake. They didn't ask permission, and they didn't explain why, simply refused to leave. Every morning when I stepped out of the cabin, there they were standing tall by the corral, their eyes scanning the horizon as if guarding the place like it was their own. My ranch, once quiet and lonely, now felt like the center of something far bigger than myself. At first I tried to reason with them. I told them I had no room, no extra food, no place for two giants who could barely duck beneath the doorway of my cabin. But they only stared at me, unblinking, as though my words had no weight against whatever promise they believed was binding us. One of them finally spoke, her voice deep and steady, saying only that a debt of life was not easily repaid. The other nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. From then on, they worked beside me, without being asked, hauling logs that took 4 men to move, repairing fences faster than I could hammer a single nail, carrying water as though it weighed nothing. It was like the land itself had given me 2 guardians, whether I wanted them or not. But having them there wasn't as simple as it sounded. Folks in town started talking. Whispers carried faster than the wind. Some called them savages, others said I was cursed. Men came riding by the ranch just to get a glimpse, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. I could feel trouble brewing, like storm clouds gathering far off. 2 giant Apache sisters, living on a white man's ranch out here? That was bound to stir things nobody could control. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake hearing their heavy footsteps outside as they kept watch. I'd catch the glow of the firelight on their faces, shadows moving across skin that told stories of a people who had lost too much already. They didn't speak much, but when they did, their words cut straight to the bone. I began to wonder if saving them had really been my choice at all, or if it was something the land itself had decided. Maybe fate had a hand in it. Maybe I had stumbled into a story much older than myself. The sisters carried scars, not just on their bodies, but in their eyes. I could see it when they thought I wasn't looking. Whatever they had gone through before, I found them was something I couldn't even begin to understand. But I knew one thing: men would come looking again. It's the kind of men who didn't like being bested, who wouldn't forgive the shame of running from 2 women, no matter how powerful they were. And when they came, it wouldn't just be the sisters' fight. It would be mine too, whether I wanted it or not. Each day that passed, the bond between us deepened, though none of us spoke of it. It was in the way they shared the work, in the way they silently took up guard at night, in the way their presence made the ranch feel less like an empty patch of land and more like something alive. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened a door I couldn't close. Saving them had set something in motion, something that would change everything. I didn't know if it would end in fortune or ruin. I only knew that my quiet life was gone for good. The horizon stretched out wide and uncertain, and somewhere out there, danger was already riding hard in our direction. The sisters seemed to know it too. They stood taller, more watchful, their hands never far from the weapons they carried. And me was caught between gratitude, fear, and a growing sense of something else I couldn't name. Whatever lay ahead, we were bound together now, for better or worse. I had saved 2 giant Apache sisters, but what I didn't realize then was that the real story was only just beginning. The days that followed seemed to move slower, though every hour carried its own kind of weight. I had lived alone for so long that silence had become part of my skin. Yet now, there was always the sound of something shifting. The sisters walked. With a heaviness that seemed to shake the earth, their movements steady and purposeful, as if every step was measured. They worked without speaking much, yet when they did, their words came with a kind of gravity that made me listen. Even if I didn't understand everything they meant, I started learning more about them, though not in the way most folks would expect. They weren't ones to sit and share stories around the fire. Instead, the pieces came little by little, in quiet gestures and half-spoken words. I learned they had no family left, no place to return to. Raiders had burned their home and scattered what remained of their people. They had fought to survive on their own ever since, wandering across the wildlands, carrying their strength like armor. There was sorrow in their eyes. But it wasn't the kind that weakened a person, it was the kind that hardened them, made them unbreakable. Sometimes at night I would catch the sound of them singing low under their breath. The tune was rough, almost broken, but it carried a power that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. It wasn't in any tongue I knew, yet I could feel the meaning in it all the same. It was a song of loss, but also of survival. It reminded me that no matter how large they were, no matter how strong they looked, they carried a history carved deep with pain. I tried to keep things as normal as I could on the ranch, though normal was a word that didn't quite fit anymore. Every trip into town became a test. People stared at me as though I had brought ghosts back with me. Shopkeepers lowered their voices. Whispers clung to the air, and I could feel the unease crawling under my skin. Some men tried to provoke me, asking if I had lost my mind letting them stay. Others muttered about how it wasn't safe, how I was bringing danger closer by giving them shelter. I said little, bought what I needed, and got back to the ranch as fast as I could. But there was no denying the truth: they had made the ranch stronger. Fences no longer broke under storms, the barns stood tighter. Even the cattle seemed calmer with those sisters keeping watch. It was as though their presence pushed back the wild itself. Coyotes stopped prowling so close, and I hadn't seen rustlers near my land since the day they arrived. Still, I knew that kind of peace couldn't last. Trouble wasn't scared of strength for long. Trouble always came back, harder than before. One evening, while I was mending a saddle strap, one of the sisters stepped inside the barn. She ducked under the frame, her head nearly brushing the beams. For a long while she just stood there, her dark eyes watching me, and she spoke, her voice carrying that deep calm of hers. She said the men we had faced weren't done. She said they would gather more, and when they came back, they wouldn't just want revenge. They would want blood. Her words settled heavy in my chest, heavier than any weight I had ever carried. I asked her why they didn't leave, why they insisted on staying when they could vanish into the wilderness, far beyond the reach of anyone. Her answer was simple. She said that when a life was spared, it bound the giver and the saved together. It wasn't a debt to be paid in coin or where Kit was a bond. Her sister nodded when she said it. I realized then that I couldn't break whatever tie had been forged that day I pulled the trigger. It was no longer just my ranch. It was theirs too. Whether the world liked it or not, but even as I tried to accept that truth, I felt a creeping unease. At night I dreamed of fires sweeping across the plains, of shadowed figures riding hard through the dark. Sometimes I woke with the echo of war cries in my ears, though no sound had truly touched the air. The sisters seemed restless too, pacing the boundaries of the ranch as though they expected riders to appear at any moment. They carried themselves like sentinels, their presence both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. The more I watched them, the more I began to wonder just how much I truly understood about them. Their size alone was something that defied reason. I had never seen anyone like them before, never even heard tales that matched what they were. When they stood side by side, they looked like warriors from another age, born of the earth itself. I caught myself staring sometimes, trying to grasp how fate had brought them into my life. I never found an answer that satisfied me. The ranch became a place of strange balance, half ordinary, half something out of legend. I tended to the cattle, fixed the harnesses, chopped wood, and yet every task seemed different with them around. Their presence filled the land in a way I couldn't explain. And always, in the back of my mind, was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was planning to return. I could almost feel the threat gathering like a storm, hidden just beyond the horizon. One morning, as I was repairing the gate near the east pasture, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt. Not cattle, not wild horses, boots, more than a few. They had stopped just beyond the fence line, as if watching from a distance before turning back. My gut tightened as I knelt to study them. The sisters appeared not long after, their shadows stretching over me. They didn't need to ask what I had found, they already knew. The look they exchanged told me everything. The time of waiting was drawing to a close. I spent the next few nights on edge, barely sleeping, the rifle propped against the door. The sisters kept to their silent vigil, their figures cutting shapes against the firelight, their eyes never leaving the dark edges of the land. I wondered what kind of men were gathering out there, how many, and what they carried in their hearts. Greed? Hatred? Fear? Maybe all of it together, which made them twice as dangerous. What I didn't say, though it gnawed at me each night, was that I had started to feel something more than fear. Somewhere between the long hours of work and the quiet moments of watching them, under the starlight, I felt a bond too strong to ignore. It wasn't the kind of bond I could explain in words, and maybe I shouldn't even try. But it was there, tying me to them just as much as they believed themselves tied to me. That realization both steadied me and frightened me all at once. The ranch was no longer just a home for one man and his herd. It had become a refuge, a fortress, and perhaps even the center of a story I hadn't meant to step into. The land was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And though none of us spoke it aloud, we all knew the truth. The men who had fled that day weren't gone for good. They were out there, sharpening their blades, loading their guns, and feeding their anger. When they returned, it would not be a simple fight. It would be war, and this time, none of us could walk away untouched. The nights grew longer, silence heavier, as though the land itself was warning us. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly saved the sisters, or had I merely tied all three of us to a fate none of us could escape? The answer, I feared, was coming soon, carried on the hoofbeats of men who would stop at nothing to take back their pride and blood. The dry season settled over the frontier like a held breath, and the river that cut past my south fence shrank to a thin brown rope. Every creak of the windmill sounded louder. Every hoofstep on the hard ground echoed like a warning. The cattle crowded around the last troughs, uneasy as if they could sense something riding toward us. I kept moving, fixing what needed fixing, but my mind stayed on the boot tracks at the east pasture and on the two Apache sisters whose silhouettes guarded my ranch from sunrise to moonrise. Their presence felt like iron. Their silence felt like prayer. By then I had learned their names, though I kept them private the way a man keeps a promise. The older sister spoke more, not with many words, but with decisions. The younger had a sharp eye and noticed everything: the bent nail in a hinge, a cloud of dust far off, the brush of a rattler in the weeds. Together they moved like a team of draft horses pulling the same weight, and I found myself measuring my steps by theirs. Still, some part of me knew we were building a life on sand while a flood gathered out of sight. I started taking shorter trips into town. Supplies, mail, feedback, and forth with as little talk as possible. The blacksmith watched me with a cautious look. The grocer, who could never hold his tongue, asked if I planned to keep the sisters as hired hands. I told him no, then saw the way that answer stirred him. People want labels for things they fear. If they cannot find one, they invent it. More than once I had to face a clump of men outside the saloon, men with nothing better to do than argue. I kept my voice calm, hands steady, and did not rise to the bait. That restraint did not soothe them. It only left something unfinished, and unfinished things draw trouble. The sheriff tried to help, though help from the law out here traveled slow. He was older, worn by sun and whiskey, but fair. He said he heard talk that a rail agent was sniffing around our valley with fresh maps and a new plan. The company wanted to stop somewhere near the ridge beyond my ranch. Tracks meant money, money meant newcomers, and newcomers meant someone would try to push old fences farther. The sheriff said he could not stop progress. He asked me to keep peace on my side of the line and to steer clear of certain men with long memories. I said I would try. At dusk, the sisters came in from the far pasture with a deer slung over one shoulder. They moved with ease, as if the weight were nothing at all. We dressed the meat out by the creek, and they spoke softly to the water before we started. I asked if this was a custom from their people. The older sister nodded, saying the river takes and gives. The land feeds those who honor it and starves those who forget. I felt that truth, like a nail-set flush. The drought had made me forget a few things. The sisters reminded me. Days passed with small signs of change. A rider stopped on the ridge and watched the homestead until one sister stood up from the corral and took a step toward him. He turned his horse and disappeared behind a rock shelf. 2 nights later, we heard a whistle in the dark short, then long. Not a coyote. A signal. The horses stamped and snorted, and I sat awake in my chair with the door open. The rifle propped where my hand could reach it without thinking. At dawn, we found nothing but a fresh gouge in the dirt where someone had knelt by the fence and peered in. Work became a way to fight nervous thoughts. We moved cattle to a higher pasture, where the grass still held a little life. The sisters dragged timbers to shore up the stockade. I repaired the windmill head, then climbed down and saw the younger sister watching the horizon with her hand on the haft of her knife. She asked why men in town wanted the railroad so badly. I told her the truth: the line brings trade, mail, doctors, and families. But it also brings men who think the old ways are dead the moment iron touches earth. She nodded and said her people had seen this before. Lines cross a land like scars, some heal, some never do. The first real test came on a Sunday afternoon. I had been setting a new post by the north boundary, sweat burning my eyes. A group of riders came down the draw without haste, as if they owned the view. There were 7 of them. I recognized 2 from the first fight, their hats pulled low, their jackets the same cracked leather from that day. They stopped just outside my fence and smiled like wolves discovering a fresh calf. I felt the sisters behind me before I saw them. The riders felt it too. Hands drifted toward belts. Words hung between us like flies. The man in front said he had lost something on my land and had come to fetch it. I told him he had lost only his nerve and that he should keep riding. He laughed and called me a caretaker for savage women. His insult slid off the sisters like rain off rock, but it cut through the air and made the cattle bawl. I said the ranch was private. He said fences meant nothing where his money reached. He glanced past me at the sisters with a look that promised ruin, then turned his horse and left with a casual wave, like a man who had just marked a target with a chalk X. That night we spoke around the fire. The sisters said these men worked for someone else, the man with the rail maps, or a rancher hungry for more water, or a gambler from the mining camp who liked to buy up failed homesteads on the cheap. We were up against a bigger plan than revenge. I realized then our fight was 2 fights tied together. One was personal. Those men had shamed themselves and wanted to wash the stain with violence. The other was about land and power, what flowed under it, what could run across it, who owned the right to say yes or no. A new thread entered the mix a few days later when I met a boy on the road to town. He was small and wiry, leading a mule with a broken strap and a pack that looked too heavy for him. He asked for water. I gave him a canteen and a bite of jerky. He said his mother kept a boarding house near the tracks, on the far side of the county line, and that men had come through asking questions about a pair of giant women living with a rancher to the west. They offered the boy a coin if he could bring a letter to me. He handed me a scrap sealed with wax. Inside was a message without a name. It warned that a meeting would be held at the dry creek bed in 6 nights, where men would choose a date to come for us. The boy asked if he could sleep in my hayloft, since riding after sundown felt wrong. I let him. The younger sister watched him that evening and then, to my surprise, showed him how to mend the mule strap with a thin piece of rawhide. The boy tried to hide his smile. I kept the letter from the sheriff, for reasons I could not fully explain. Maybe I did not trust the town to stand with me. Maybe I feared the law would try to solve a complex matter with a single rash move. Instead, I rode to an old friend who ran a stage stop on the canyon rim. He was a quiet man, a veteran of more fights than he ever talked about. He had lost a hand in the war, and he used the stump as neatly as most men used 5 fingers. He looked at the letter for a long time, then said something that sat me back. He said the rail agent's name, a man I had heard once years earlier during a dispute over water rights. That agent had a history of clearing people off ground he wanted by letting bad men loose, and showing up later to buy the land and calm the mess. It was an old trick with a new suit. Back at the ranch, the sisters trained me in their way of reading distance. They showed me how to stand where my shadow would not give me away, how to feel the light shift on my skin near dusk, how to listen through wind to catch the hollow sound of a rider crossing a rocky wash. We set signal stones stacked 3 high, a piece of twine tied to the corner of a post. The hinge of a gate turned just so. I learned that protection is not just a strong wall. It is a web of small truths that together, worn before a shout, needs to be raised. Meanwhile, the boy's presence sparked something I had not expected. The younger sister softened around him, though her eyes never lost their sharpness. She raised a small shelter for the mule and fixed the roof with such care you would think it belonged to a prized stallion. The boy asked questions about their people. She answered a few, then asked him about the boarding house and the way the train cut across the night with a line of sparks. He said sometimes men tossed bottles at the windows when they were drunk on payday. The older sister listened and held back a grief I could feel even without looking at her face. There was no romance in her, only a steady choosing of what must be done. Yet, I could see she loved her sister fiercely and would move mountains to keep her safe. Another subplot took root when a widow from town visited under the excuse of buying a calf. She was a strong woman with a straight back who had managed her own farm since fever took her husband. She talked about crops and the price of seed, then lowered her voice and said men had pressured her to sell. They spoke of fences that would become worthless when the tracks cut a new path to the river. She was tired of standing alone. She asked if I planned to stay. I told her I did. Her eyes flicked to the sisters, and I caught something like respect there. She rode away lighter than when she came, yet I knew she would be tested soon. 6 nights passed. The meeting at the dry creek bed was set, and I meant to be there, though not where anyone could see me. The sisters insisted on coming. We reached the rise above the creek at dusk and settled among the rocks. Below us, lanterns flared in a circle, throwing long shadows across the cracked mud. Men filtered in, more than I expected. Some from ranches I knew by brand, others strangers from the mining camp. After a while, the rail agent appeared. He wore a neat coat and shiny boots, but moved like a man used to rough company. He greeted the riders as if they were old friends. A hush fell that felt colder than the night air. I could not catch every word, yet I heard enough. He spoke about a right-of-way through the valley and an agreement already signed in distant offices. He said a few stubborn parcels remained and that delays cost investors money. He shrugged when someone asked about law. Then he hinted that a proven threat might justify a sheriff's order, and that he would be happy to compensate those who helped prove the point. Sacks were passed quietly from hand to hand. I felt the older sister's breath grow deeper beside me, the kind of breath a person takes to keep from moving too soon. One man at the edge of the circle raised a concern. He said the sisters were not ordinary, and that a direct attack might fail again. The agent smiled and said there were easier paths. He talked about fire set to grass upwind, about shutting the windmill, about scaring the herd into breaking fences and trampling what we needed to live. He did not say murder. He did not need to. His meaning came through clear. The men nodded, some eager, some hesitant. Before the group broke apart, the agent set a date, an hour. I felt time narrowed to a point. We slid back from the ridge and left without a sound. The next morning snapped by with a tightness in my chest. I could not stretch away. We cut fire breaks around the barns and cleared brush that had gathered over the years, where my eyes had grown lazy. The sisters showed me how to dig shallow lines that could redirect a running fire toward bare earth. We checked the windmill and built a second water line to the far paddock using old pipe I had never bothered to fix. The boy carried tools, wide-eyed but steady. Even the herd seemed to sense we were preparing for more than weather. They clustered near the ranch house at night. Pressing their bodies together, horns clicked softly, a chorus of breath rising like fog. On the day before the set hour, the widow returned with her wagon stacked hike anvis buckets and jars of preserves. She said she was visiting a cousin across the ridge and that it made sense to leave supplies for a neighbor. She did not look me in the eye when she said it, and I decided I would not insult her by pressing for a truer reason. Community in a hard land is a delicate thing. You do not praise it out loud. You keep it in silence and let it do its work. When the sun fell that evening, the sky went red like a cut-in cloth. The younger sister stood on the roofline, a dark edge against the color. I climbed up with her and we watched the far hills. A single glow appeared and then vanished, then another farther north, like matches struck and quickly blown out. Testing, measuring. I thought of the rail agent somewhere, planning to count burned timbers as proof of danger and to file papers the next morning. I thought of the riders, some driven by pay, others by pride. The older sister joined us without a sound. She said a wind would rise after midnight. She could smell it. She told me to sleep for 2 hours, no more. I lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling boards. The ranch felt different in the dark, like a living thing braced to spring. I could hear the sisters outside, padding across the dirt. At some point I dozed and woke to a change in the air that raised the hairs on my arms. The wind had come. It slid under the door and carried the faintest trace of smoke. Not thick, not near, but enough to say the first move had been made. I grabbed my boots and stepped onto the porch. The sisters were already facing the east ridge. Flames licked along the dry grass far off, low and thin, but spreading with purpose. The line moved toward us in a shallow curve, guided by a hand that knew the lay of the land well. The older sister touched my shoulder once, firm and quick, then pointed to the fire breaks as if to ask whether I trusted what we had built. I nodded, though my heart felt like a colt trying to bolt its halter. More glows bloomed to the north and the south, set wide to split our attention. Somewhere out there, the men were riding, ready to push cattle, cut lines, and make panic do their work for them. I could see the shape of the conflict now in full: the revenge, the land grab, the prejudice that would cheer when the story was told with the facts crooked. There was no place to run from it. There was only one small ranch, 2 giant Apache sisters, a stubborn rancher, a watchful boy, and neighbors who might choose courage or caution when the moment came. The wind rose another notch and drew a hot breath along the ground. Sparks lifted. A horse in the south paddock squealed and kicked the gate. I caught the younger sister's eye and saw no fear there, only a clear decision to stand. She moved toward the pump. The older sister took the ridge above the barn with her bow and a quiver, not to aim at men, but to shoot burning clumps out of the air before they landed. I checked the rifle and the water lines. In the distance, a horn sounded once, then twice, and the fire jumped as if answering to a command. The first flames reached the outer brush and flared. The night brightened to the color of a furnace door cracked open. Shadows leaped. Somewhere hooves pounded a rhythm that pulled the blood up into my ears. I looked at my hands and saw they were steady, the way they get when a man has chosen his place. I understood then that we were not only protecting fences and roofs, we were protecting the right to belong where we stood, the right to say no when someone else said move. It was a narrow right, yet it was everything. The air filled with smoke that tasted of sage and old leaves. The fire breaks held for the moment a dark braid in the orange. The boy ran buckets like a drummer, beating time for a marching line, face streaked with soot. I heard another horn, this one closer, and the panicked ball of cattle forced from the far pasture toward the weakest part of the fence. The rail agent's plan was unfolding step by step, and the worst parts had not started yet. The older sister called out in a voice I had never heard from her before, low, fierce, and impossible to ignore. The land listened. Even the fire seemed to pause. Then, from the north, a new light appeared that did not belong to flame. It was a lantern held high by someone riding fast, and behind it came the shapes of more riders. Some I knew. Some I did not. Whether they were allies or another wave of trouble, I could not tell. The wind bent the grass, and the sparks danced higher. Between the lantern light and the fire glow, the frontier looked like a place both ancient and newly born. And in that charged space I felt the whole weight of what was coming, race toward us with all the power the old American land could muster. The night turned into a furnace, every breath heavy with smoke and ash. The fire spread in hungry tongues across the dry grasslands, pushed hard by the rising wind. The flames didn't just crackle, they roared, alive with purpose, as if answering the commands of the men who had set them. Sparks floated through the air, glowing embers that landed on hats, shoulders, and roofs, daring everything they touched to burn. The land itself seemed to shift beneath my boots, every shadow moving with the pulse of danger. The sisters stood like sentinels carved from stone. The older one positioned herself on the barn roof, bow drawn, loosing arrows tipped with rags that smothered burning clumps before they landed. The younger one stayed by the pump, feeding buckets into the boy's hands with machine-like rhythm. My arms burned from hauling water, yet I could not slow down. Every second felt like it mattered. Every drop of water, the difference between holding the line and watching the ranch collapse into black ruin. Through the haze, I saw movement on the ridgeline riders. The lantern swayed in the hand of the lead man, throwing a sickly glow across the land. Behind him came a wave of figures, some I recognized from the first ambush. Others strangers with eager faces twisted by firelight. They were not charging yet. They were circling, waiting for the flames to do their work before making their move. It was a tactic as old as warlet. Fear break your enemy before you lift a hand. The cattle bawled in panic, their hooves hammering the ground as they pressed against the fences. The dry boards shuddered and groaned. I shouted to the boy to keep buckets at the gate, knowing if the herd broke loose they would scatter into the fire and be lost. He nodded, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes burned steady. The sisters had given him courage without a word, and in that moment he looked older than his years. The widow's wagon appeared in the distance, racing through the smoke. She had no reason to be there, yet there she was, the reins clenched tight, a tarp covering her cargo. She pulled hard, stopping just inside the yard. When she pulled the tarp back, I saw barrels of water and sacks of grain. She said nothing, only lifted a bucket with her own hands and started passing it forward. The sisters glanced at her once, then accepted her as though she had always been part of the plan. It struck me then how this land, harsh as it was, bound people together in ways nothing else could. But the enemy wasn't waiting any longer. A horn split the smoke, followed by the crack of rifles fired into the air. The riders began to push closer, using the fire as their shield. The younger sister raised her spear, the metal tip glowing faint in the orange light. The older one shouted something in her own tongue, the sound so fierce it made even the cattle pause. Then the first shots came, bullets hissing through the smoke, striking wood and earth with angry sparks. I dropped behind a water trough, rifle snug against my shoulder. My first shot found a rider too eager at the front, knocking him clean from his saddle. The sisters didn't flinch. The younger charged forward, using her size to drive the cattle back from the weak fence. The older loosed another arrow, its arc graceful even in the chaos, striking a torch from a raider's hand before it could be thrown. Every move they made reminded me that this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was theirs, and they were meeting it with a power that no man could mistake. The raiders closed the distance, but they weren't rushing in blind. They knew we were braced for them. They split into two groups, one circling wide toward the corral, the other aiming straight for the barn. The plan was clear: set fire to the structures, drive the cattle into the flames, and leave nothing but ash behind. They didn't care how many of them fell, so long as the land was ruined when they left. The widow threw me a look sharp enough to cut steel. She said we couldn't fight fire with buckets alone. We had to turn the herd loose, drive them toward the raiders, use their panic as a weapon. I knew she was right, but the thought twisted my gut. Those cattle were my livelihood, the heart of the ranch. Losing them meant losing everything. Yet if I held them here, they'd be trampled, burned, or stolen anyway. The choice wasn't between keeping them or not, it was about how to use them before they were gone. I gave the nod. The boy ran to cut the ropes, and with a deafening crash, the gates burst open. The herd poured out like a flood of muscle and horn, bellowing in blind terror. The ground shook as hundreds of hooves pounded past. The raiders hadn't expected it. Their horses screamed and bucked as the stampede swallowed the space between us, scattering men in every direction. Fire met flesh and chaos filled the valley. But even in the chaos, I saw the real danger. The rail agent himself sat back from the fight, safe on higher ground. His coat was spotless, his boots gleaming. He didn't raise a weapon. He only watched, making notes in a small book, as though the blood and smoke were just lines in a ledger. He was the kind of man who let others do his fighting, who believed paper and ink carried more power than guns or fists. And in his own way, he was right. For even if we won this night, his words on that page could twist the story into one where we were the villains and he the victim. The fire grew stronger. Licking at the barn walls despite our breaks, the older sister leapt down, her arms blackened with soot, and pressed her shoulder into a water barrel, rolling it toward the flames. The younger fought at the fence line, her spear striking with the force of a hammer, holding back to riders who had pushed too close. I covered them with my rifle, every shot a prayer not to miss. The widow loaded buckets into the boy's hands faster than I could count. Her dress torn, her face smeared, but her will unbroken. The sound of battle was everywhere. Shouts, gunfire, hooves, the howl of fire-eating wood. Yet under it all there was a strange rhythm, a steady beat like a drum. It was the sisters' voices, chanting low and deep, their words rising above the noise. It wasn't anger in their tone, but something older, something that reached beyond fear. The chant steadied me, steadied all of us. It made the ranch feel less like a patch of land and more like sacred ground. Then came the moment I had dreaded. A section of the corral collapsed, flames rushing through the gap. The cattle scattered wildly, half of them surging back toward the yard, the rest breaking east into open ground. In the chaos, 3 raiders slipped close enough to make a charge at the house. They carried rifles low, their eyes fixed on the porch where the supplies were stacked. If they reached it, everything we had left would go up in flames. I raised my rifle, but the smoke blurred my sight. Before I could fire, the older sister stepped into their path. She didn't hesitate. She moved like the land itself, had risen to block their way. Her bow bent, arrow flying, and one raider fell before he could even lift his gun. The second drew close enough to swing his weapon like a club. But she caught it in her hand and snapped it in two as if it were nothing more than a twig. The third turned to flee, but the younger sister was already there, cutting him off with a strike that dropped him cold. The battle turned again, but the fire was still advancing. The barn roof sagged, timbers groaning, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. If the barn fell, the whole ranch would go with it. We had bought time, but time wasn't enough. I wiped sweat and soot from my eyes, searching for the agent on the ridge. He was still there, calm as ever, watching the destruction with the patience of a vulture, waiting for the dying to stop kicking. The wind shifted, carrying more heat, more smoke. My lungs burned. The boy stumbled, his arms trembling from the weight of the buckets. The widow pulled him back, forcing him to rest while she carried the next load herself. The sisters moved like giants in the firelight, their shadows towering across the yard, fighting not only men but the very force of nature itself. It was a sight both terrible and magnificent. Something I knew I would never forget as long as I lived. And then came the sound that froze my blood, a whistle from the ridge, sharp and commanding. It wasn't a retreat. It was a signal for the final move. From the north, more riders poured in, hidden until now, fresh and eager. Twice as many as before, armed with torches, rifles and ropes. They weren't just here to burn us out. They were here to end it once and for all. The sisters tightened their grip on their weapons. The widow set her jaw, and the boy rose despite his exhaustion. I braced my rifle, knowing this was the moment everything balanced on the edge. The ranch behind me, the fire around me, the raiders before me, and the agent above me, pen in hand like a judge ready to write our fate. The land was about to decide who would stand and who would fall. The horn blew again, louder than before, and the riders charged. The ground shook with the fury of their approach, the fire roared in unison, and the sisters raised their voices in that deep, haunting chant. My finger tightened on the trigger as the world narrowed to one single truth: the climax was upon us, and there would be no turning back. The riders thundered down the slope, firelight flickering across their faces. For a heartbeat, the sound swallowed everything, hooves pounding in rhythm with the roar of the flames. My chest felt tight, my hands steady on the rifle, though my mind spun with what was at stake. The sisters stood unflinching, their shadows stretching tall against the orange glow, chanting in voices that carried above the charge. The widow braced a pitchfork in her hands, her eyes sharp and fearless. The boy lifted a bucket as if it were a weapon, ready to throw water or stones, whatever he could manage. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. I fired the first shot. It struck true, dropping a rider before he could lift his torch. The herd that had broken east now circled back, confused by smoke and noise, cutting into the path of the raiders. Horses screamed and stumbled, men cursing as the stampede tore holes in their line. The younger sister ran straight into the chaos, her spear flashing, 8 strikes scattering men who thought their numbers gave them strength. The older one loosed arrow after arrow, each finding its mark even through the smoke. She moved with a calm that felt older than the hills. The raiders tried to push through, but the fire that was meant to be their ally turned against them. The wind shifted suddenly, driving flames back toward their flank. They had to choose between fighting us or fleeing the blaze. Many tried to fight still, but their horses refused, rearing and bolting in panic. The chant of the sisters rose louder, echoing off the barn walls like a drumbeat of the earth itself. Even the fire seemed to bend away from them, as though their voices carried the weight of generations who had fought and endured. In the middle of it all, I saw the rail agent on the ridge. He was no longer calm. He shouted at his men, waving his arm, his neat coat glowing red in the firelight. He had expected a swift victory, a ruin he could step in to claim. Instead, he saw his men breaking, their numbers swallowed by smoke, cattle, and 2 warriors who refused to fall. For the first time, he looked afraid. He turned his horse to ride, but the widow saw him. She dropped her pitchfork, grabbed my spare rifle, and raised it with a steadiness I hadn't expected. Her shot cracked through the night. It didn't kill him, but it shattered the lantern he carried. Flames splashed up his coat, his horse rearing in terror. He vanished behind the ridge, swallowed by smoke and shadows. With their leader gone, the raiders broke. Some fled into the hills, some rode straight through the fire in desperation, their screams lost in the wind. A handful dropped their weapons and begged for mercy, but the sisters gave them only silence. They did not need revenge. Defeat was enough. The last of the gunfire faded into the crackle of dying flames. The ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken. The barns smoldered, but had not fallen. The corral was half gone, but enough remained to gather what cattle survived. We had held, though none of us felt like victors. When the smoke thinned, the boy collapsed in the dirt, exhausted. The widow knelt beside him, brushing soot from his hair. The younger sister leaned on her spear, her chest heaving, eyes still fixed on the horizon as if expecting another charge. The older sister climbed down from the barn roof and looked at me. No words passed between us. None were needed. In her gaze was the truth we had fought as one. And because of that, we still breathed. The dawn came slow and gray, the air heavy with ash. The valley looked like a battlefield, black streaks carved across the land where the fire had run wild. Cattle milled nervously, lowing in confusion. A few lay dead, but most had survived. The fences were ruined, but they could be rebuilt. The water lines still flowed. The ranch was wounded but alive, and so were we. Word traveled fast. By the time the sun was high, men from town rode out, drawn by the smoke they had seen from miles away. They found the broken weapons, the bodies of raiders, and the blackened ground. Some shook their heads in disbelief when they saw the sisters standing tall beside me. The sheriff arrived not long after. He listened as the widow told the story, her voice steady, leaving no detail twisted. The boy backed her words with what he had seen. By the time I spoke, there was little left to add. The sheriff spat into the dirt, said the rail agent had overplayed his hand, and promised to carry the evidence to the judge. For once, I believed him. In the days that followed, neighbors came with timber, nails, and hands ready to work. The widow brought seed for the fields, saying it was better planted here than left in her wagon. Even those who had once whispered in town stood shoulder to shoulder, hammering boards, hauling water, mending what had been broken. The sisters worked among them, their strength turning back-breaking labor into simple tasks. At first folks kept their distance, but as the days passed, suspicion faded into awe, then into respect. Children followed the younger sister with wide eyes, marveling at her size. Laughing when she lifted wagon wheels as if they were toys, the older sister taught the boy how to listen for shifts in the wind, how to read the sky for rain. The land began to heal, and so did the people. I thought often of the rail agent. Rumors came that he had been burned badly, that he fled the county with nothing but the clothes left on his back. Some said he was seen begging for coin in another town, others that he vanished into the desert, never to be heard from again. I didn't much care which was true. His plans for this valley were over, and that was enough. As for the sisters, they never spoke of leaving again. When I asked, the older one reminded me of the bond we shared, that saving a life tied people together beyond choice. But I had come to see it differently. They weren't bound here by debt. They stayed because they chose to, because this land, scarred though it was, had given them a place to stand without fear. The ranch was no longer mine alone. It belonged to all of us. The widow found her strength renewed too. With her farm safe for now, she became a voice in town, warning others that selling to men with smooth words and slick papers was a fool's bargain. Folks listened, and the valley held together. The boy returned to his mother's boarding house after a while, but he came back often, bringing stories of trains and travelers, of a world changing faster than we could hold it. Each time he came, he stood taller. The lessons he had learned written into the way he carried himself. I often walked the pastures at dusk. The sisters flanking me, the herd spread wide against the horizon. The sky would blaze with color, red fading to gold, then deepening into the quiet blue of night. In those moments, I understood that survival wasn't just about fences, cattle, or water. It was about people, how they chose to stand, how they chose to fight, how they chose to remember. Looking back, I realized that the day I saved the sisters was the day they truly saved me. Before them, the ranch had been a place of silence, a life spent keeping to myself, surviving but never living. With them, it became something greater. It became a place worth defending, a place where strangers became family, where the strength of the land flowed through every hand that touched it. The valley never forgot the night of fire and smoke. Stories spread, told and retold in saloons and around campfires. Some spoke of giants who walked the earth, others of a rancher who defied an army. But the truth was simpler. We stood together when it mattered most, and that made all the difference. As the seasons turned and the grass grew green again, I found peace in knowing that the ranch stood not just as my home, but as a testament to resilience. The sisters remained by my side, guardians of the land, symbols of strength in a world that often forgot the value of it. The widow thrived, the boy grew into a man, and the valley held against the pressures of greed and change. I had once thought I saved 2 giant Apache sisters, but in truth, what happened on that night, and in all the nights that followed, showed me something greater. They gave me a reason to fight, a reason to believe that even in the harshest of lands, bonds could grow stronger than steel. The ranch was scarred, yes, but it stood, and so did we. And as long as we did, no fire, no raider, no agent could ever take it away. That was the lesson the land left with me. Survival is not about standing alone. It is about finding those who will stand with you, no matter the fire, no matter the storm. And in that truth I found not just survival, but a life worth living.